Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Hubert, and I'm the director of the MA in Writing program. And I'd like to welcome you to our thesis reading this evening. I'd like to begin our evening by thanking all the parents, partners, siblings, friends, babysitters, and coworkers of our students who are here tonight because they recognize the value of this writing work. I'd like to thank, on behalf of our students, each of these friends and family members who maybe helped with tuition, unloaded the dishwasher, or put the kids to bed when technically it wasn't their turn, who read a novel chapter or an essay or the same article for the gazillionth time and gave feedback, for supporting these students in ways large and small. I'd also like to thank our faculty, so many of whom have joined us today, for sharing their considerable expertise with students and giving so generously of their time. I know that this is time that always comes at the expense of their own writing because they care deeply about their students. This time is a gift graciously given, but I know it's not without sacrifice, so thank you. Finally, I'd like to thank our alumni for joining us today as well. Our alumni are part of a vibrant literary community in cities all across the country, and I'd urge our students to connect with them as they are the ones hosting reading series, networking events, and monthly write-ins, as well as editing literary journals, volunteering as writers in the schools, and participating in writers groups that endure long after their time in our program ends. Thank you for giving back to the community and keeping the literary flame alive. This fall, we have 22 students graduating, with 15 reading their theses here tonight via Zoom, and 7 reading live on the Johns Hopkins University campus in Baltimore tomorrow night. But all of our readers have this in common. Each one of them has completed a 50 to 75 page thesis of high quality writing. This writing, a short story, a personal essay, an article, a novel, began as a tiny idea, a spark that flitted through their brains at some inopportune moment while they were waiting to place a pizza takeout order or doodling in a notebook during a particularly dull budget meeting at work or vacuuming Cheerios out of the cracks of the car seats. And they held on to this idea. They mulled over it. They cradled it in their hands and examined it. Then they blew on it to see if they could get some sparks, set it flaming into a bonfire of a story. And this Promethean feat of stealing fire from the gods requires 4 things. 1, faith that there's merit in their story. And here I envision a comet with some hapless writer holding on to its tail, both the TAIL and TALE, as it whips them through the sky, taking them hither and yon as it searches for concrete form. 2, the second thing is commitment. Committing to the hard work necessary to give this idea life on the page, to find the right structure, the right voice, the right style to tell this story. And this commitment, as noted earlier, requires foregrounding the story in one's life. It means evaluating its importance above the strategic plan that's due at work, the heap of laundry in the hamper, or the leaves that need raking. 3, it requires bravery. One of our faculty members, Susan McCallum Smith, talks about how good writers need to touch the bruise. That phrase resonates among students and has been bandied about quite a bit, touch the bruise. What she meant was that writers need to move toward the pain, not avoid it. I've often looked in askance at writers who say they find writing therapeutic. To my mind, writing, good writing anyway, is always painful because it takes us to the darkest places in human nature. It demands that we touch the bruise. And 4, this is where the MA in Writing program comes in, we must open ourselves and our delicate, precious little flame of a story up to examination, to feedback, to suggestions, to criticism. And this can be hard. One of our faculty members, James Frankie Thomas, wrote about this workshop experience in LitHub last year. He wrote, On Tuesday, February 27th, 2018, I showed up to Novel Workshop with the customary armload of snacks and 12-pack of soda, set them on the conference table as a bribe for my classmates, and exchanged some rote pleasantries before taking my 3-hour vow of silence. You're not allowed to talk while you're being workshopped. And I wasn't allowed to speak. So I just had to sit there and take it over and over. I was so flabbergasted. I bet you could see a giant cartoon exclamation point floating over my head. How had my entire workshop read my novel so wrong? Stranger still, how had they all read it wrong in the exact same way? There was only one possible explanation, something I'd long suspected but never dared to admit out loud. Everyone was stupid but me. So I think most of the writers in the room have had that experience. We've grown defensive and inwardly stewed for days sometimes until we're ready to open ourselves up and consider that there may be merit in what our classmates or colleagues and instructor have to say. Until we are ready to hear, to grow. And when we are, then we've got those four essential ingredients: faith, commitment, bravery, openness. And notice I didn't say raw talent. That's because talent is just a starting place. That is what I looked for in all of your applications to the MA in Writing program. And that is what I saw in your work already, or I wouldn't have accepted you. What you did with that talent while in the program, well, that's what we're about to see here tonight. For those in the audience, you're in for a treat. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Susan Mahadi Daraj, who will be introducing our readers.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here. I've had the honor this semester of working with all of these students in their thesis class. And by way of introduction, I'll just say that writers have a kind of an inside joke that, everyone that we meet thinks that creative writing is something that's easy to do, right? A lot of us have heard people say things like, I'd like to write a book sometime, maybe for fun, or maybe when I retire, or maybe as a side gig, right? The readers tonight and their faculty can tell you there's absolutely nothing that's really fun about producing a piece of creative writing, as Karen just described. It's a pretty rigorous process. Um, it's definitely not something that's fun. Maybe it's satisfying, maybe there's a sense of accomplishment, maybe there's a feeling that you have when you're done writing that, you've given your thoughts and feelings a beautiful outlet. Here's how Joyce Carol Oates, the celebrated American novelist, describes the process of writing. She says, getting the first draft finished is like pushing a peanut with your nose across a very dirty floor. And I know the students here are nodding their heads in agreement at that description. The writers you will hear from tonight have been through this process. They've pushed the peanut across the dirty floor with their noses, and I'm proud to say that they have succeeded in producing that first draft. In fact, they've produced polished and engaging second, third, fourth, and fifth drafts of their thesis manuscripts during their time in this program. Tonight, you will hear excerpts from their work that demonstrate that their writing is demanding, sophisticated, and emotionally accessible. I've been honored to work with them these past few months as they completed their final semester and their final course. For 2 years or more, they have been hard at work producing original material, studying practical and theoretical books on the art of writing, reading the great writers closely to study craft, and workshopping the manuscripts of their classmates, thus learning the skills of an editor. They have been finding and fine-tuning their individual creative voices, and we are thrilled to share their words with you this evening. Tonight, you will hear a wide range of work in a variety of genres: fiction, nonfiction, everything from horror, young adult, fantasy, and more. You will travel to a high school and meet a basketball player who struggles with grief, identity, and a broken heart. You will travel to central Montana and spend time with a family whose parents are dying in hospice. You will meet a young girl and travel back to the 60s to meet her, a young girl who is leaving her Navajo reservation in Arizona. You will hear the adventures of a college graduate who explores the Yukon Territory of Northwest Canada as a last foray of independence. And you'll meet a talented high schooler who struggles to manage the complicated emotions related to her obesity, the drama surrounding her friends, and her parents' divorce. And you will travel to Rwanda at the height of the genocide and meet a group of international doctors struggling to do good. Let me say this to the graduates. For your professors, many of whom are here tonight, this is an especially rewarding evening. We are seeing the culmination of your work, and we will recognize many of the pieces you're reading because we saw them first in a workshop, and we watched as you carefully and painstakingly revised, edited, and expanded the writing. Nobody knows better than we do that this work is hard work. The challenge is to sit with a world that you have conjured up on the page, to render it realistic to a skeptical reader, and have no doubt even fantasy, science fiction, magical realism, they all must feel real to your readers. And finally, you must make it emotionally accessible to your audience. We congratulate you on this tremendous accomplishment, and we are excited to see where you go next. So let's begin our evening. Each graduate will read for a few minutes from their thesis, and tonight we will begin with Courtney Lowry Kogel.
Thank you, Susan. Tonight, I am reading from my thesis, Shelter Belt, which is 2 sections of a larger memoir and essays titled You're Not From Around Here, a story of 2 farms, of land, of longing, of loss, and of whether or not we can ever truly go home. Part 1, present day. In the end, both of their arms reached for the ceiling. My mother's arms dark, short, and impossibly soft. My father's arms pale, gnarled, and impossibly long. The hospice nurses told me that it was just part of it, the physical process of dying, but it looked so much like they were reaching for something or someone, their eyes focused on what we couldn't see, maybe the sky, maybe each other. My mom and dad had barely spoken in 2 decades. They started dating at 13, they were married for 26 years, they'd been divorced for nearly 20, and they died 8 months apart, reaching for the sky. My whole life, I'd seen my parents reaching for the ground, cultivating, planting, repairing, harvesting, toiling. The farm was the 5th member of our family. There was dad and mom, my older brother Steve, me, and there was the farm. Whether the farm was another sibling for me and my brother or the 3rd wheel of my parents' marriage, I'm still not sure. But it was always there, giving, taking, sheltering, and then eventually letting us all go. I promised myself that I would never let it happen again, to form such an attachment to a piece of ground, to build my life and my family around a place. And yet, early February 2020, age 40, funeral home, Great Falls, Montana. It's still winter, but there's a whiff of spring. I drive the dirt roads along the Fairfield Bench into the Sun River Valley, along the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, what some call the front. This is a place on the cusp, in the in-between of mountain and prairie. Here there is a sense of being both and that makes it a hard place to leave and a hard place to stay. My husband and I moved here on the edge of the Rockies 12 years ago to start a small farm to be closer to our families. On the edge is a perfect description of how we feel here. The sense of otherness in a landscape where we feel so at home has blindsided me. I park in mom's driveway shortly after 9 a.m. like I have most mornings in the last few months after the doctors told us her cancer was terminal. When I open the car door, I hear the first chickadee of the season. High, high, low, low, it coos. The chickadee call was our family's call when I was growing up, the one we whistled in the woods when we got separated, or in stores when one of us wandered off to the next aisle. The story goes that mom and dad heard the chickadee on their honeymoon and decided it would always be their way to find their way back to each other. I'd like to go to the funeral home today and get everything settled, mom says when I walk into the 3-bedroom double wide she bought after the divorce. She holds her checkbook in her hand. It's a quick, quiet drive to the funeral home, and I'm not ready for this. I cannot understand how she could be. When we pull into the parking lot, we are the only car. It's so empty, she says. There's no one here. I see that for what it is, a setup for the joke we told when I was a kid, whenever we passed a cemetery. Oh, haven't you heard, I say? People are just dying to get in there. She holds her ribs. It hurts her to laugh. I wheel her in her wheelchair through the big grand doors of this late 90s sprawling beige funeral home, both of us still giggling. Dying to get in there, mom says again in a whisper as I open the door. Mom gravitates to the case of merchandise in the corner. It's filled with engraved lockets and rings and pendants and money clips. In the center is a collection of jewelry featuring an odd-looking stone. As we look closer, we read that these stones are made from your loved one's ashes. Oh, for God's sake, she says, rolling herself away from the case. Ick, promise me you won't do that. Not a chance in hell, I say, as we walk and roll back to the front desk. Well, I don't think I'm going there, she says. I snort loudly enough that the echoes bounce off of all of the beige all around us. Mom holds her ribs again. A small, round, bald man in an ill-fitting suit softly comes up behind us, introduces himself. He looks confused by us and perhaps a bit scared. First things first, my mom says as she slides the funeral director's binder across the table toward her and opens up to the pages of options. Flowers. Pallbearers, Mr. Funeral Director asks later. Can it be anyone, she asks. Anyone you like, he says. Well, she says with a sly smile, then I want Elvis. Mr. Funeral Director still looks frightened, but then he cracks a small, careful smile. He pauses and looks at us and says, you know, if you scramble the letters of funeral, you can get real fun. His smile turns to a face that asks us, too far? Mom waves him off and shoots me a quick glance. This will be fun to talk about later. And where should we direct any memorials in your name, he asks. Hospice, I ask her, or maybe we could set up a memorial scholarship at the school. Oh, honey, I don't need to be remembered forever by everyone. I just want to be remembered by my family and the people who love me. She turns to me and says, don't you think? Yes, of course, Mom. But I also scribble as many notes as fast as I can because I want to remember everything she is saying and doing and how she's sitting and how she looks, because in this moment, I want everyone everywhere to remember her forever, and I want them to remember her just like this. Finally, again, like her best self. Funny, joyful, faithful, brave, and full of love. We sit in silence for a bit, me trying to imagine the day of the funeral, and then worse, trying to imagine her imagining the day of the funeral. I look up from my notebook, and she's gazing out the window at the sky. They're starting to look like spring clouds now, she says. These are the kinds of clouds you can see things in. See, right there, there's a dragon. And look, there's a dog with his tail up.
This reading is the opening paragraphs of my short story, Take It Like a Woman, which is about a young woman and a mother's journey through her marriage. It touches on the themes of family, love, loss, infidelity, and the sacrifices women make and the strength they have to endure. My marriage started the first Christmas after my daughter was born. Marco picked us up from my mama's house in Juarez, Chihuahua, and drove 24 hours to Gilman, Illinois. He described Gilman as green as a park with trees and grass and lakes, but in December, everything was covered in snow. Lilia and I slept most of the trip in the back seat of a pre-owned metallic green Chevy Impala with small cracks and tears in the cold vinyl upholstery. As we crossed the Oklahoma border into Kansas, the warmth in the air vanished. I could see Marco's breath as he sang along to the car radio. He had a beautiful voice. Just the Way You Are by Billy Joel was playing, and I came to find out it was his favorite English song. As I stared out the car window into the vast darkness, the melody of the song caused the corners of my eyes to pool with tears. I felt an urge to tell him to turn the car around and to take me home, but the exultation in his voice and on his face kept me at bay. Lilia and I remained silent in the back seat, wrapped in the blanket my mama had given me to keep us warm in the frigid winter of the Midwest. My sister Carly and I often talked about leaving Juarez, but never thought it would happen, and certainly not like this. I knew I was pregnant with Lilia early, and I tried to keep it hidden, but our adobe home only had 2 rooms, and the walls were in poor condition with cracks. My mama and Carla could hear me in the bathroom, dry heaving on an empty stomach. Mama was resigned and Carla upset, but both agreed I had to tell Marco right away. That evening, when he came over, we sat outside on the cement retaining wall. The sun was setting, and the dirt and cobblestone streets began to fill with life. Friends passed by would stop briefly to say hello before migrating to the corner to greet other friends under the lamppost. Marco asked if I wanted to go with them, but I declined. Before he could say another word, I told him I was pregnant. He got quiet and pensive, then asked if I wanted to marry him. I nodded, and we sat in silence a little longer. I opened my mouth to tell him he didn't have to marry me, when with a slight chuckle, he said, well, if we're going to be married, I better ask for your mama's blessing. I'll be right back. He started to jog down the street, then turned back to give me a kiss. With a silly grin, he said, "Don't move." Several minutes later, he returned with chicken tacos, bottles of Barrilito sodas, and grabbed me by the hand and escorted me into my house. Shortly after that, Marco informed us he was going to the United States to make some money. He said he'd be back for me in a few months. We did not have a telephone, but I gave him our next door neighbor's telephone number for an emergency. He promised he'd write. For the first weeks after he left, I checked the mailbox daily, but after a couple of months passed, I began to lose hope. He never wrote or called. After 6 months passed, I accepted my fate. Then his letter arrived, and inside was $50. He asked that I write him back and let him know if I had the baby and what it was. He said he would be coming for me and the baby in December. Underneath the excitement, we all had doubts and then worries when he did come. Carla asked me, "What are you going to do in Gilman, Illinois? You barely speak any English, and Marco's isn't much better." That evening, before we left, my mama and I packed the second-hand bag Marco had bought to put Lilia's and my clothes in. "Marco is a responsible man," she began. Her marriage had ended before I was school age, and Carla was just an infant. Our father was a soldier. He left for the Pacific to fight in the war against Guatemala and never returned. We assumed he died, except for that one time we overheard her tell someone she saw him at the Centro with his arms around another woman. Mama said she walked past him and they did not speak. Mama worked all day, every day, washing and ironing clothes to earn just enough to buy rice and beans and keep the utilities on. "Soli, siéntate," she said as she patted the mattress with her hand. I sat next to her. "He will provide you and Lilia a better life."
Hi, my name is Becca Richards. This is the opening of my young adult novel about a high school basketball player. In this chapter, Faye finds out that her least favorite teammate is planning a prank for their after-school practice. My phone buzzes in my hoodie pocket, sending a thrill up my spine. But Mrs. Rodriguez has a clear sightline from the front of the room, so I try not to react. I always keep my phone accessible during language arts, my last class of the day. Lena's a senior, and she has an independent study for 6th period. Theoretically, she's supposed to work in the library, but Lena's indifferent to rules like that. So she hangs out in the varsity basketball locker room, where she'll send me predictions about practice or photos of her dog Nutella. Finally, Mrs. Rodriguez turns to write on the board, and I slide my phone into my lap. But the message isn't an over-under on how many sprints we'll run at the end of practice or a post-bath pic of Nutella looking bedraggled and sad. I stare at the text message from Lena. Heard Kate's planning something. It's hard to pay attention after that. All throughout our discussion of the Crucible, I wonder what idiotic, mortifying locker room prank my least favorite teammate dreamed up this time. Often Kate's antics are mild. Silly string fights, water balloon ambushes, googly eyes stuck over photos. You know, senseless chaos that everyone else finds hilarious. Other times, well, it's been 4 months and I still can't stomach Oreos. But no matter what it is, this time I'm going to smile and laugh and play along. Be a team player. Show Lena, show everyone that I can take it. After the bell, I power walk to the locker room. Rationally, I know none of my teammates are uncool enough to rush to practice like I do, but I still pause outside the locker room door. As always, it's impossible to hear anything over the clamor of 3,000 students stampeding to the bus lanes. I check my phone. Lena hasn't texted again. So I push open the heavy door and take a tentative step into the locker room. Inside, it's silent, and I relax a little. The room's dominated by the massive, bright white lockers that line 3 of the walls. Our lockers are 6 feet high, open front. The interior is covered with photos, newspaper clippings, and handmade signs. Lena sits sideways in her locker with her knees bent, earbuds in, dressed for practice. Her black mesh shorts puddling at the top of her thighs. She's alone. The small, colorful sunset painting she's been working on sits on the floor. Faye? Lena turns her head and peels out an earbud. I sling my backpack in my locker. Hear anything more? I try to sound casual. Lena swings forward and unfolds her long legs. At almost 6 feet, Lena's our tallest player. She's honestly skilled enough to play any position, but mostly plays power forward. No, don't stress. Dominique could have been wrong. That's not helpful, especially since Dominique, one of our senior captains, isn't often wrong. But I don't want Lena to see how anxious I am. I glance at the countdown on the whiteboard, the bubbly 13 one of my teammates sketched before practice yesterday. Lena's more artistic than any of us, but she never bothers to update the countdown. 12 days now until the first game of the season. 12 days until we'll put on our uniforms, our shiny shooting shirts and tearaway pants, and hold hands in a circle to pray. Then line up in the hallway outside the gym, tense and jittery as we await the first beats of our run-out song. 12 days to convince Coach Nelson that even though I'm only a sophomore, I deserve a spot in the starting lineup. Thank you.
My name is Kevin Kerwin. My thesis, The Jesus, Mary, and Joseph Conundrum, is a collection of linked stories. This excerpt is from a chapter entitled Pretty Little One. In the summer of 1978, I turned 16 and we celebrated Sarah's quinceañera. Other than the occasional run into town in my uncle's pickup, our lives together up to that point in time had pretty much been contained within the boundaries of the ranch. That was about to change in the coolest way a newly christened 16-year-old boy could have possibly imagined. My uncle had purchased the ranch 18 years prior, and it had come with the usual complement of equipment, including 2 antique tractors that were destined to never again move under their own power. When he finally relented and sold them for scrap, it took me the better part of 2 days to dig those monsters out from their fastness at the back of the equipment barn. Sarah spent that entire time crouched in the loft above me, trying to coax Hamish out from behind one of the barn walls. "He hasn't come to see me in over a week," she said. "I think he's been living out here." I could see her slight figure on the catwalk overhead, silhouetted against the sunlight that was steaming in through the open loft window, her face partially obscured by an atomized cloud of decaying nitrogen-based fertilizer and concentrated rat shit. My almost certain future death from lung cancer will inevitably be traced directly back to this precise moment in time. There were still a dozen rusted out 50-gallon steel drums between me and the tractors, empty now, but they'd definitely been filled with something at some point in their lives, probably something toxic. It took me 2 hours to hump the barrels out into the yard, after which I paused to rinse my entire self down with the garden hose. When I returned, Sarah was standing in the center of the now nearly empty barn, watching Hamish shimmy backwards down the rear wall. She cut her eyes sideways at me, a slight smile playing at the corner of her mouth, as the dirt and the dust began to settle with a purpose onto my newly saturated skin and clothing. Hamish hopped down onto an old workbench and disappeared into the shadows behind the nearest tractor. He reemerged almost immediately, covered in cobwebs, nose twitching, paws waving in the dusty air. "He's been waiting for us," Sarah said. I wasn't quite sure then, although I figured it out later, how much of Sarah's relationship with Hamish she imagined, and how much had at least some basis in reality. But I'd seen what a fully grown raccoon could do to a good-sized dog if properly provoked. I took a step towards Sarah, and she immediately held up a hand. "No," she said softly, her eyes riveted on Hamish. "Don't." As far as the raccoon was concerned, he and Sarah were the only ones in that barn. His eyes never wavered as she closed the distance between the two of them. "I see you," Sarah told him. It took every ounce of self-control I could muster to not physically intervene. But Hamish leaned into the hand Sarah offered without hesitation. He let her run her fingers down his back, and he allowed her to stroke his tail. "Did you know that raccoons can purr?" Sarah pressed her forehead against his, closed her eyes, and breathed in his scent. "You're a spirit guide," she whispered, cupping his chin. "An alebrije, one of the ancients. How did I miss that?" Then she turned and held a hand out to me. "Come, Sammy, he wants to show us something." The old motorcycle the raccoon led us to had sat unmoving and unremembered for years. The tires had rotted and were hanging in shreds from the rims. The chrome was pitted and encrusted with rust. Most of the original blue paint was still there, and as time and quite a bit of elbow grease would eventually prove, still capable of holding a shine. Once we'd removed the coverings, we rolled her out into the sunlight. "I think we should call her La Poderosa," Sarah pronounced solemnly, "the mighty one." Rest assured that Sister Peggy had made absolutely certain Sarah was intensely familiar with all things Che Guevara, including the name of his ironically christened motorcycle. Sister Peggy says that if she had to choose between death or fornication with a member of the opposite sex, Guevara is the only man she would even consider fucking. "Okay, well, we're not naming the motorcycle La Poderosa for that reason alone," I told her. "You've been spending way too much time with that nun." I stepped back to admire the old bike, a 1950 Triumph 6T Thunderbird. If you owned this motorcycle and you had a girl, she was already on the saddle behind you with her arms wrapped tight around your waist. If you didn't have a girl, then that shortcoming would be rectified in short order. The Thunderbird represented everything a teenage boy treasured most in life, including absolute freedom from the bounds of parental authority. Sarah thought it was the sexiest thing she'd ever seen. I couldn't stop grinning for the next 3 months. We named her Balita.
My name is Damien Suklau. This excerpt is from my short story collection, and the name of this story is Pete's Garden. It's about a fatherless boy who finds renewal while witnessing the rekindled relationship between two elderly visitors. Clara is digging around in her bag. She's a sprite woman with auburn hair, wearing a green flowery dress with a bow at the front. She is slim, around medium height, with her hair in a bun. And despite her age, her skin is smooth with hardly any wrinkles. She must be sitting on the stairs, and in a soft and comforting voice, she beckons me down. Maybe I'm going to like her after all. Our house is old, I tell Clara, showing her around. It's neither too big nor too small, but it's comfortable. I point out the central living area where the chimney used to be and the other smaller rooms that branch off to the sides. In summer, upstairs is a sauna, I explain to Clara, but in winter, when it's cold and snowing outside, my room freezes. Even now, with fall barely starting, downstairs feels chilly because of leaks in the foundation. I open the door and show Clara her room. Though the floorboards creak with every step, inside feel warm and cozy, and I smell the pine-scented air freshener Mom sprayed this morning. There's a small bed in the corner, and beside it sits a nightstand with a box of tissues. While Clara pushes down on the mattress to make sure it's soft and comfortable, I point out the robe hanging on the door and the corner dresser with extra soap and linens. In the bathroom, I show Clara the medicine cabinet above the sink. I drag the shower curtain along its metal rings and turn on the squeaky faucet. The pipes start shaking and gurgling in the wall, and the water starts flowing. Test the temperature before you get in, I tell Clara. Sometimes it gets too hot. What about the backyard, she asks, looking through the window. It used to be beautiful once, I tell her. Now it's all covered with weeds. Mom says she'll replant it one day soon, but she can never find the time. I leave Clara downstairs to settle in and go up to my room. Around 2 o'clock, I hear the heavy rumble of a vehicle coming up the street. The noise gets louder and louder, then stops in front of our house. From my window, I see an old man come out of a beat-up truck with a sign on the door that says, Pete's Gardening. He is tall and lanky and wears a blue coat that hangs on his frame. He hovers up the steps and rings the doorbell. I come out onto the landing just as Clara opens the door. She looks excited. The man gives her a bouquet of bright yellow flowers, and I see her lips curl into a smile. Pete, she says, clutching her chest. You remembered. They smile and wrap their arms around each other as she invites him inside. The man's footsteps echo across the wooden floor as they head into the living room. Mom told me to expect this man and to be respectful. She said that Clara knew him years ago when they were both very young, but that after a silly argument over nothing, they went their separate ways. Only recently, after all these years, he found out she had fallen and reached out. Mom said he drove over 100 miles to get here. They sit around the table and talk for a long while. It's clear they have a deep connection. You can tell by how comfortable they are with each other. After a while, they get up and go into the kitchen. I hear the back door open, then slam shut. It's almost 6 o'clock and Mom will be home soon. I head down to the kitchen and start working on the dishes. I see them hanging out on the patio, a small sitting area with 2 iron chairs. They're chatting and laughing. Be careful, he tells her, holding her hands and pulling her closer. I don't want you falling again. Thank you.
I'm Jessica Lozano, and I will be reading a selection from my novel in progress called I Am Not Marita. This excerpt is from the first chapter, which introduces a Navajo family as seen through the eyes of a visiting journalist in 1968. The hospital, the Kienta Health Center, is a low, squat building with a single wing for patients. It's a Saturday, and the place appears mostly abandoned. I follow the timid mother and son into the lobby, down to the corridor of rooms. They step carefully on the speckled linoleum, less sure-footed here than I'd seen them on the valley floor. A stout woman in white is exiting the room as we approach, and she stops just outside the doorway. Dolly slips past the coming confrontation, and I glimpse a form lying limp in a bed before Dolly gently pushes the door closed. I stand back in the corridor, watching the woman speak to Nez. Your wife cannot go home. She's not strong in the heart. Nez nods. His gentle voice is hesitant. Good, I take her home, he says. Very bad heart trouble. The doctor said she must stay here. Her short blonde hair shudders as she shakes her head. I take her home now. No, Mr. Jones, I'm going to call the doctor. She looks at Nez, then at me where I lean against the sterile white wall. She waves a hand in the way you tell a dog to stay and moves down the hall, thick rubber soles muffling her steps. Nez opens the door and I again glimpse the room. Dolly stands backlit by the window, cradling a wrapped infant, its black hair stark against the white swaddling blanket. The woman, Mrs. Jones, hasn't moved from her position on the bed. Nez enters the room and turns to shut the door, catching my eye before the gap closes. I wander toward the sound of the nurse's voice and find it near the wing's entrance. The woman, whose brass lapel pin reads Nurse Horner, is standing at a telephone table, clearly in consultation with the doctor. She glances at me before studying the table again as she speaks. Yes, sir, I will, sir, she says. It'll be a few minutes. She listens and digs a fingernail into the wood grain. All right, thank you, sir. She hangs up and turns to me. Who are you? Horner leads me to her station as she explains that Mrs. Jones is gravely ill. She's had a lot of children, she says, almost to herself as she shuffles through the papers on the desk. We've seen her an awful lot. I don't know how many kids offhand, I'd have to look. She leans over and takes a file folder off the desk and flips through the stapled pages, silently counting. This was her 19th pregnancy. She has 11 living, with this the last one. 4 miscarriages and 4 died after they were born. She looks at me. Do you know what that amount of pregnancies can do to a woman? No one can stand that. Her heart is just worn out, that's all. She thumps her finger on the page. Worn out. She's 37 years old. Nez emerges from the room first, followed by Mrs. Jones, and then Dolly, the baby in her arms. Mrs. Jones is small, smaller even than Dolly, and her face looks nearly drained of blood. Nez gently takes her arm, guiding her toward the exit. At the end of the corridor, Horner steps in front of them, the telephone's long cord smacking limply against the wall as she waves it in their direction. I have the doctor on the line, she says, looking at Nez. He waves her off with a firm gesture. Horner tries again, waving the phone toward him, but when he doesn't respond, she sighs heavily and lifts it to her ear. He won't speak to you, sir. They're leaving. Doctor's tinny voice rings out of the speaker, a buzz of curses and frustration, but finally he says, all right then, take her home. Horner repeats his instructions to Nez, her voice an echo of his. She glances at Nez, then Dolly, and finally at me as she speaks. A specialist will come from Farmington in 2 days. He'll come to your home, to the Hogan. Make sure you're at home, make sure she eats, make sure she rests. I drive back to the property with Dolly in the passenger seat. She had helped Mrs. Jones into Nez's truck, carefully settling the baby in her lap before they drove off. The family needs some time together, she explains. The rest of the children will be home by the time we return, and someone needs to take care of the animals. I ask her what it's like having so many children around. She slowly shakes her head, her eyes small behind her spectacles, and puts a dry hand to her lips. Finally, she says, "It is a blessing. My son is blessed."
This is the opening chapter of my contemporary novel about Rosie, a 24-year-old bisexual woman whose goal is to keep her past locked tightly away. In this chapter, she tries to do just that. Chapter 1. Kieran pulled his jocks up and smiled at me lightly. It's fine, really. My cheeks flushed. It wasn't like I owed the guy an explanation, but I couldn't help but feel bad. He was gorgeous, in a nice guy kind of way. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the type who opened the door for you on a first date, who beamed at you from across the table as he poured you a glass of wine. The nice kind too, which we were both slightly tipsy from. I thought that I was ready. Hell, I'd wanted to be ready. But the second he was inside me, my insides burned. My, down there hurts, I'd said, and he immediately pulled out. God, I'd sounded like my mother. Down there, seriously? Could I not say the word vagina in front of the nice guy? Shit, sorry. He'd scrambled for words. Is there anything I can do? Grab a bottle of wine from the fridge, I'd wanted to say, or better yet, the vodka. But no, I couldn't tell the nice guy that for the past 3 months, I like to get shit-faced instead of feeling even a fraction of what I felt now. Broken. We can cuddle. He was doing everything right. I wouldn't be surprised if he had a book at home titled Love, Sex, and Relating for the Modern Man, right next to his copy of Investing 101, Make Your Money Work for You. There was nothing wrong with him. In fact, I knew he'd make someone very happy one day, someone called Caroline. They'd have 2 perfect kids together, have scheduled sex on the weekends, and holiday somewhere warm and expensive because he learned at 25 how to make money work for him. That's more than I could say for myself. Anxiety rose within me at the thought of the contract I'd signed only 6 months ago when my first novel, Witch City, turned out to be a raving success, to everyone's surprise, including my own. Signing a contract and accepting an advance was one thing. Not being able to write and potentially being in breach of that contract, well, that was the beast I was currently raging against. The only problem was that it wasn't looking like a fair fight. Scratch that. There was no fight. There was only a blank Word document staring at me accusatorially day after day. Maybe I have to become the beast in order to fight the beast, I said, a burst of inspiration shooting through me. I pushed Nice Guy's arm off me and ran to my desk. Dragon Slayer warrior girl, but then she realizes that she is the dragon. I wrote wildly on a loose piece of paper. Wait, what? Kieran called from the bed. Fuck, he needed to go. Maybe I was onto something, finally. My agent was getting more and more frustrated with me by the second, and I couldn't keep lying to her. I also couldn't keep lying to my readers, the very people who had made Witch City so successful. Everyone wanted another book. I wanted to write another book. This is what I'd dreamed of my entire life, and the second I had it, it all turned to ash. Ash. The girl bleeds fire down on her kingdom, turns it all to ash. Could that work? Earth to Rosie. Kieran walked over to me and kissed my neck. What are you writing? I'm trying to write this book, I said, not knowing what else to add because, well, there was no book. That's awesome. So you want to be a writer? Sure, I said. I suppose that's one way to look at it. I didn't want to be a writer. I was a published writer. Did that still make me a writer, though? I hadn't been doing much writing lately. Perhaps all I ever had within me was that one book. Holy shit, Kieran yelled, looking around my room as if he'd only just seen the piles of books spread messily about the place, which was shocking because the room was more piles of books than it was anything else. Witch City, he read aloud, by Rose Calloway. That's me. What's it about? I spun my chair around to face him. One night, I said dramatically, a town is struck by lightning, gifting all women magic. Kieran lowered his eyes to my boobs and then quickly lifted them back up. And the men? What about the men? Why didn't they get any? He asked innocently. What do the women do with the magic? Whatever the fuck they want to do. Kieran came over to me and sat down on the edge of my desk, his face now lit up by his phone. Badass, feminist, and fucking spicy, he read. A world where power dynamics are shifted. Count me in. Was he seriously reading the reviews? Wasn't my cup of tea. Who let this angry bitch write a book? He burst out laughing. Geez, this person said it's a feminist rant. I'd hate to read all this stuff about myself. So did I, which was why I tried not reading my own reviews. The only problem was that I broke that little golden rule occasionally, although at least I did it with a glass of wine in one hand and my best friend holding the other, not after a shitty attempt at sex with some guy who found my bad reviews funny. Scratch what I thought earlier. He wasn't a nice guy. He must have read an incredibly hilarious one because his laughter was picking up again. Feminist. Yes, feminism, angry bitch, blah, blah, I said flatly. Are you done? Gee, sorry, he said. I was trying to have a little fun because it wasn't like we were going to... Kieran stopped himself mid-sentence, clearly realizing what he'd said. His face flushed and he quickly scrambled around my room collecting his clothes. When he'd successfully picked up all his stuff, he kissed the top of my head and said, I had a great time tonight. I'll call you.
Good evening. The main character in my novel, Visceral, is inspired to join the FBI after the kidnapping and murder of his younger sister. This scene describes the events immediately prior to the discovery of her body. Clayton Brinson sat in the back of a pickup at the boat ramp behind the levee. The ramp was a popular spot for local high schoolers to drink and smoke and hook up, one of several safe havens in a never-ending game of cat and mouse with the local sheriff. The students gathered inside a circle of pickups packed around a large bonfire, yelling to each other over the music blasting from one of the trucks. Young men drinking cheap beer from expensive coolers stood by the fire, summoning the liquid courage to approach the girls sitting on the tailgates. Several passed around a joint in the darkness outside the circle, and a few couples had parked under the nearby trees, fumbling with each other's buttons as they rounded second base. Clayton and his buddies were younger than most of the others at the landing. They were wary of the older boys with their frat shag haircuts and overpriced boots, and they tried not to stare at the older girls in their tank tops and cut-off jeans. They passed around a bottle of Jack Daniels and pounded natural lights from a case in the bed of the truck. Clayton gazed from person to person through the bonfire until he inadvertently caught the eye of Slade Shoemaker. Shoemaker was the quarterback of the football team, a bully in a jacked-up truck and designer camouflage. He zeroed in on Clayton with a smug grin. "What the fuck are you looking at?" Clayton stared at him through the flames. "Me?" "Yeah, you, dipshit." He motioned for someone to kill the music and walked around the fire. Clayton said something to his friend on the tailgate beside him and smiled. Shoemaker reached the truck and knocked the beer out of Clayton's hand. "What, you got jokes now, asshole? What'd you just say to your little shithead friend?" "I was just telling him how you're a fucking prick." Clayton Brinson was not a large person, but he was lightning quick, with a taut core and sinewy arms shaped by countless hours working on his family's land. He wasn't scared of anyone except his father. Definitely not a piece of shit like Slade Shoemaker. Shoemaker yanked the younger boy off the tailgate and slung him to the ground. He stood over Clayton. "Get up." Clayton sat up and looked at the older boy. "Come on, your little friends aren't going to save you tonight. Get the fuck up." The crowd had pushed into a tight ring around the two. Clayton stood, not taking his eyes off Shoemaker. He grinned and held his hands out to his side, palms facing the sky. Shoemaker lunged and swung at the younger boy's eye. Clayton feinted right, and the blow glanced off his cheekbone as Shoemaker's momentum carried him forward onto the ground. He spun around, and Clayton grabbed him by the hair and kneed him in the nose with an audible crack. Bright red blood gushed down Shoemaker's chin onto his shirt, and his eyes glazed over as he rolled onto his back. Clayton was on him before he hit the ground, raining punches with both hands onto the quarterback's temples, his head bouncing off the hard-packed dust. He continued long after Shoemaker had gone still. By the time two older boys yanked him off their friend, Shoemaker's face was a swollen mask of torn and bloody tissue. Clayton looked at his dirty Carhartts, the right knee darkened with the other boy's blood. He wiped his hands on the side of his pants and ran the back of his wrist across the small abrasion on his cheek. Then he walked around the fire to his buddy's truck, grabbed a beer, and strode down the boat ramp to the edge of the Blackwater.
Hi, my name is Charlie Suby, and I'll be reading an excerpt from the opening of my novel, Heaven's Door. Heaven's Door, Chapter 1. The book was an oracle calling out from deep within some gold mine, a voice as old and as pure as a Native American vision quest. Written by a wildland firefighter, it was what brought him to the on-ramp to Interstate 80 US 101. It was an unusually hot August day in San Francisco as he stood alongside the curb awaiting a ride. The combined highway split apart about a mile up, heading in two different directions. Jeffrey had already hitchhiked one of them many times before, but now he stood ready to travel the other, a radical undertaking unlike anything he had ever done before. Jeffrey Woodward was 22 years old, 18 months out of Yale, and 3,500 miles away from his mother's grave and his father's strict conservatism. Waiting for him back home in Washington, D.C. was the doting young nanny, almost like the older sister he never had, who raised him after his mother died, and more importantly, his aforementioned father, with his wealth and power from whom Jeffrey presently felt estranged. Home could have been the other side of the world for all it mattered to him, because his father wasn't sharing any enthusiasm about this crazy adventure to the Yukon Territory. He was not willing to drop a penny on his freedom-seeking beatnik son, who had already journeyed to the Haight-Ashbury within 24 hours of his solemn graduation. This was just as well, though, because Jeffrey wanted to prove he could do something, anything, without his father's support and guidance. The year was 1981. For Jeffrey's party wished it was 1960, an era where wild ideologies and spiritualism were still underground and free from commercialization. But alas, he spent his most formative years at the hands of conservative prep school professors, followed by 4 lackluster years at Yale, preparing to grab onto his father's shirt tail. While there was growing cynicism in Jeffrey's life, he wasn't some radical leftist hoping for Reagan's American dream to crash and burn. In fact, he was a far cry from that. Despite the revelations from the crazy book he found, or that found him, he would soon be on his way back to Washington to work for his father's lobbying firm representing mining interests in the southwestern United States. But at that moment in his life, his intestines were filled with dread about this ready-made future. Perhaps it was because it was just too easy and he didn't feel competent or worthy of it. So he was trying to delay his inevitable doom by taking this journey to discover the last great frontier land of the Klondike and perhaps find a guiding light. And then there was the book that in 3 days changed Jeffrey's life, setting him on an odyssey to the Arctic, fell off a shelf directly into his hands in a dirty, dusty used bookstore on Haight Street, where, having been encouraged by his sort of girlfriend, he was looking for information on Native American shamanism. The book was written by a wildland firefighter living near Mount Shasta, California, and it literally fell from a shelf, bonked him in the head, and landed in his hands, leading a stoner standing a couple feet away to exclaim, "Wow, heavy, that means something, man." Just that fact alone should have foretold danger interpreting forthcoming events. His mystical experience had been confirmed by a slovenly pothead who seemed to envision great tidings ahead for him. Virtually no information was given about the author, not even a photograph. The cover had a Dali-esque picture of celestial angels holding up a mirror that showed the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden and a serpent slithering in the grass in front of it. Jeffrey was expected back in D.C. in September, having had, as his father was wont to say, his tomfoolery. But now, because of this wild book, there would be a slight alteration to his plans. A last hurrah. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Brian Valencia, and I'll be reading an excerpt from my current work in progress, a horror novel titled Harvested. With themes of family redemption, Matthew Grinch dies alone in his apartment and is fully aware that he's dead, experiencing every sensation as he decays. Once his remains are discovered, embalmed and buried, his remains are harvested from the grave and reanimated. In this chapter, Matthew Grinch struggles to gain control over his own body while encountering another being like himself. Matthew's usual determined gait dwindled into a shuffle. The device was having a matched pace of a silhouette ahead of him, a figure who was lumbering in an empty road and bearing a severed arm. The downtown strip's normal quickened pulse no longer beat this late at night. The air was moist from passing rain, and the usual pungent odor of old wet garbage from the nearby dump was faint. Run-down streetlights, the ones that still worked, gave a soft glow reflecting off the slick, wet roads and detailed rude amounts of litter clinging to the curbs. The figure that lumbered in the road remained obscured in heavy shadows. Like Matthew, it was to be unseen. It had been weeks since he'd seen another creature like himself. He was curious to know how similar they were, whether or not it had a device embedded in the vertebrae of its neck, or if, like him, it was a reanimated corpse who was losing its grip and the closer it got to the graveyard. When Matthew first got control, he had hoped that it would last a little longer. However, gaining command was scaling mountains that were constantly changing and growing taller. He could only go so long before he had to rest. Something seemed familiar about this person, though. The thought itched and demanded attention like a festering mosquito bite. Even though it was possible he might have seen it in the underground, Matthew couldn't shake the thought that perhaps they met before he died. He needed to be sure, and that meant he had to get at least a hand on the steering wheel. Matthew emptied his mind. Like before, tried to gain control of his breath. Heat rose at the base of his skull like hot wires. As he fought the slow, rhythmic breaths that the device had defaulted for him, he let all thought melt away and focused on breathing faster and faster. Pain shot through him the more he resisted. When it seemed like his mind was about to boil, his breath quickened and the burning cooled down. The next step was getting his little finger to twitch. Again, he focused, repeating the words to himself, move, move, move. A burning ache climbed through his spine and down his arm to his right pointer finger. It began to move. It was slow at first. Matthew imagined it was like playing the piano, and the song was building until his finger began to spasm back and forth. The other fingers followed, playing to a crescendo. Now he was in control. Every nerve in his body was on fire. The device was stronger the closer they got to the underground, and that meant he had a limited foothold. Matthew shifted his thoughts to his eyes. Ever since dying, he hated moving his eyes. Dried out and filled with grit, they felt like sandpaper moving inside his sockets. At times, there were formaldehyde tears that stung to such a degree it was like trying to see through acid. Move, move, move. His eyes crawled to one side, locking onto the figure in the street. The darkness obscured much of it. He could tell it was a man, though. About a foot taller than Matthew. However, he was much thinner. A tall stick bug, he thought to himself. The man was clearly carrying an arm that looked like it had been ripped off at the elbow. The dead fingers of the arm were frozen in place, gripping a metallic sphere the size of a baseball. I wonder what his purpose is, Matthew thought. Reflected in the passing streetlights was the white part of the man's exposed skull. An empty eye socket could be seen with a dim purple glow and matted long hair that reached his short beard. If it wasn't for the suit, Matthew would have pegged him for just another one of the town's permanent street residents. The mountains were growing taller, and control was leaving Matthew. His fingers slowed until it stopped twitching, and his breathing came back down to the slow rhythmic baseline that was set by the device. His eyes, however, lingered and focused on the hand and the severed arm and the orb it was holding. The man's shuffling pace slowed, and Matthew's gait matched it. The roads were a dark mirror reflecting the streetlight, and he could see the distinct bright purple fluid dripping from the man's coat and onto the street. In an instant, every detail of the man was seen under fast approaching headlights. His black tie and suit, brown hair intertwined with streaks of gray, the severed arm with broken bits of bone sticking out of the end with its grip locked on that dull metallic ball. It was clear now he was carrying his own severed arm, as the one that was missing, leaving a torn mess of a stump that dangled from his shoulder. Then there was the car. Headlights came and went so fast that all Matthew saw was a dark blur pass right through where the figure was walking. There was a heavy plop. The smell of wet burning rubber filled the air. A slurred male voice of the driver saying, "Oh, fuck." Matthew couldn't see anything he wanted, like what the vehicle looked like that made impact. He wanted to see the person driving, to see if it was more concerned with the damage to his vehicle or the person he just hit. He wanted to see the license plate as he drove away, but what he wanted didn't matter anymore. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lisa Roberts Carter, and I will be reading from my young adult novel, Fat Positive, which follows high school student Zanaya Richards as she struggles with obesity and her parents' divorce. I blinked. She smiles. "You're back," says Shaquana. She leans forward, resting her cheek against mine. Her blonde and brown box braids sweep over my face, the warmth of her friendship replaced in the nothingness inside me. A nurse in Carnation Scrubs, Emily, her name badge says. She smiles at me. "We almost lost you. You coded," she says. "I what?" "You coded," Emily repeats. 20 years of nursing, never heard cold blue called on one person that many times. "Honey, you must have angels watching over you," she asks. "I know her secret," I say, my head too heavy to lift or turn. "What are you talking about?" Shaquana asks. "I was thrown into a dungeon and poisoned with a jelly donut. I fell into a deep sleep, and when I awoke, I couldn't see anything. The darkness was thick like black fog. I opened my mouth to cry for help, but no words came. She had taken away my voice with her evil black magic. She did it to silence me." Shaquana's brows shoot upward like they've been yanked on. "Why are you looking at me like that? You don't believe me." "You fell really hard, Z. You hit your head." "That evil sorceress Ashley poisoned my jelly donut," I say. "You're not making sense, Z. No one poisoned you. You were dehydrated. She's just trying to keep me from telling her secret, that she is no different from me. I'll go get your mom and tell her you're awake, says Shaquana. Shaquana is my ride or die. 100 pounds soaking wet, but she isn't bothered that we can't shop in the same stores like besties and swap clothes in the dressing room or tell one another that outfit is snatched. She never mentions the sinkhole I left in her mother's couch either. Your mom went to get a cup of coffee, says Nurse Emily. The feeling of nothingness returns. She's going to be thrilled to see that you're awake. Wonderful woman and a nurse too. Yeah, a nurse. A nurse who didn't notice all the signs were there and still she didn't notice. Too busy wondering why he left us, I guess. We used to talk about things other than my weight. We went to the mall, got our hairstyle, painted toes, played Monopoly, took turns being the banker. She sang and I hung along out of tune. She sang in the shower, in the bedroom, in the kitchen, on the patio. She doesn't sing anymore. Her voice has been replaced by another. Always there, greeting me every morning like Queen Grimhilda's enchanted mirror. Only she never says I'm the fairest of them all. Good morning, well, she says, as I splash water on my face. I mean mug her and spray her face with shaving cream. She laughs. One morning, as I comb through racks of tops in various shades and sizes looking for something to wear to school, my mirror image says in a voice that mimics my own, "You're never going to fit. You're never going to find anything that fits." Starting with 2X and searching until I found a 4X, yellow square shape made of cotton and spandex, the combination of fabrics that won't make me look like a giant inflatable. I pop my head through the yellow opening of the top, followed by hand in each of the arm openings. I pulled down hard, but the shirt stubbornly rested on my melon-sized bops. I stretched the fabric and pulled harder. My image in the mirror laughed and said, "I told you so." I screamed for Mom to rescue me from the yellow blob. She rushed in and yanked and tugged as I pleaded with her to hurry. "I'm trying, Zanaya," she says. "Maybe next time you might try going up a size. Could we talk about this later? I'm suffocating here." My words came out muffled, like when I talk with my mouth stuffed with pizza. "Almost done," she said. She shoved my left bob under the yellow t-shirt, paused, took a deep breath, shoved the other bob under the shirt, then a quick, hard tug downward. "I got it, Mom." She waited as if to see if she'd have to cut me out of my shirt. Not the first time. Her face relaxed only after my back dimples were shrouded in thick cotton and I pulled down into the fabric covered in my rotunda. That is what I call my waistline. "Yellow is such a pretty color on you," she said. "I look like a beach whale, covered in a yellow tarp," I said. Not the response she wants, but she returned a smile, a sympathetic smile, too sympathetic. She told me that Kenyatta's sister Emily lost 50 pounds on her new diet. I knew it was coming. A new weight loss plan. 4 months ago, it was vegan, and 2 months before that, ketogenic. Always after someone says that one of their fat relatives dieted and lost only over 30 pounds in only 30 days. Diets don't work for me. "There's always the bariatric clinic," she said. The bariatric clinic. No way was I going on one of Dr. Noun's 1,200 calorie diets. I stared at the woman who could fit her entire body into one of my pants legs. "Mom, I have to go." "I love you," she says. "I know." I walked to the bus stop across the street, my inner thighs slapped together, creating a symphony. Cameron was at the stop bopping, probably to one of Jazzy Z's songs. He pulled out an earbud and hollered, "What up, girl?" like he does every day. "It's all good," I replied, as I do every day. "It's all good."
Good evening, and thank you for being here. My name is Rachel Reitz, and I will be reading an excerpt from my novel, The Book Was Better, which follows a young literary agent as she travels back home for her sister's wedding. Peter was not a romantic. It was simple, really, something I'd grown to grasp and to appreciate even. Peter was someone who loved crunching numbers. He loved facts. He adored it when everything made sense, was orderly, determined, and known. Peter wasn't a romantic, not like I was. He didn't think it was fate that my ex-boyfriend showed up at the same coffee bar that I was in. Peter didn't think it was whimsical that my car broke down and I had to walk home, falling through the front door, sopping wet from a rainstorm that had sprung upon me. Peter never liked it when it rained. Never would dance with me in it or kiss me in it. He merely popped open the umbrella or ushered me inside towards the nearest awning. Peter didn't appreciate the sappy and dramatic movies that I did. He always complained that my favorite Thai restaurant downtown was too spicy and cramped. And so no, Peter wasn't a romantic. But where I was overly emotional, Peter leveled me. It was because he wasn't a romantic that we had worked. He had helped me see the logical side of things, to slow down and assess the facts, not the feelings. With him, I knew what to expect. Whatever was logical would be how Peter reacted. And so, when I told him I would miss his dinner on Friday, I waited for his logical reaction. I expected a conversation, or at least an exchange of curt words. What I didn't expect was for Peter to stop eating entirely, wipe his mouth with a cheap takeout napkin, and wordlessly stand from the coffee table where we had been sitting on the floor eating our food. The click of our bedroom door was so silent it seemed to shout, reverberating through our tiny apartment. He stayed there for the entire night, and while he didn't lock the door, he'd never shut me out to be cruel. I still slept on the couch. I had no idea if Peter would drive me to the airport this morning. Not until my bags were parked in front of the door and he looked at me expectantly, dressed and ready, his hair still a bit wet and tousled from his shower. But what I did know, maybe it was the prophetic romantic in me, was that he would break up with me. It wasn't a matter of if, only when. The knot in my stomach and the set look in his eyes told me all that I needed to know. He was looking at me now with the same look as we sat parked in front of my gate. It was a mixture of melancholy and acceptance. Goosebumps exploded across my arms. I turned the air conditioning vent away from me, the frigid air blowing against my shoulders. Where do we go from here? It sounded like he was proposing a plan for a new contract at the firm. What do you mean? I knew he would break up with me, my mind grappling for something to say. I'd grown to love him, but if I was being honest, I wasn't in love with him. He was a steady, a comfort I was desperate to keep. But did I want to fight for it? Could I now? What would my life look like without him? Boxed macaroni and cheese, trashy television, and a never-ending cycle of doing nothing but work? But with Peter, at least there was decent takeout food, intellectual shows, and a break from the monotony. I mean, you can't just run away and expect me to grovel after you, or hell, follow you all the way to Maryland for an entire week. I have a life here, too. I have work. I didn't ask you to follow me, I said quietly. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Michael DeFranco. My thesis is a collection of nonfiction stories about landmarks in South Florida. I'm going to read the introduction for the one on Fort Jefferson, which is located in Dry Tortugas National Park. The title of the piece is Fort to Fort, Escaping an Unbearable Paradise. During long Midwest winters, a chill burrowed deep inside my bones. I fantasized about living in a tropical climate and never leaving. What could be better than the beach, warmth, and sun every day? My dreams became reality when I relocated to Fort Lauderdale for work. It's tropical, but not always idyllic. Hot, humid summers and violent weather cause unrest, but they're not nearly as disruptive as tourists, who can turn even the most pleasant and social locals into misanthropes. Every year in March, forces converge here, creating circumstances as unsettling as a Category 4 hurricane. Snowbirds linger in returning to their northern homes to avoid the cold days of early spring. They congest streets, restaurants, and stores. Meanwhile, college students invade and behave like wild beasts. Errands that usually take 10 minutes turn into purgatory. Getting a seat at my favorite restaurant becomes impossible. The beach takes on the appearance of an overflowing trash can. Noise distracts me all day and keeps me up half the night. In the middle of this storm, one thought prevails. I need to escape. With an international airport 10 minutes from my apartment, the options for getting out of town initially seem endless. But I decide to focus on somewhere within driving distance, preferably a one-tank trip. Everglades National Park, just west of where I live, comes to mind, but my fear of getting attacked by a Burmese python or an alligator kills that idea. Prior trips to Florida's southwest coast, to places like Marco Island, Siesta Key, and Naples bored me, and those towns might suffer from the same March madness as Fort Lauderdale. I surf the internet, study Rand McNally's road atlas, and speak with travel agents. My hunt finally reveals a suitable place, Dry Tortugas National Park. Remote yet close by, it's about 250 miles southwest of Fort Lauderdale. Getting there requires a drive than a boat or a seaplane. The boat is much cheaper, but the threat of seasickness makes the 3-hour ride undesirable. The seaplane settles as the more appealing and cooler option. I book a plane reservation and pack my bags. The drive from Fort Lauderdale to Key West on Saturday morning is a breeze. At 6 a.m., US Route 1 South winds through the urban landscape free of accidents, rubbernecks, laggards, snowbirds, and roadhogs. I pass Miami's skyline and palm tree farms in Homestead. The 7-mile bridge leads me from the Middle Keys to the Lower Keys. I arrive at Key West International Airport ahead of schedule, check in, and take a seat outside on a covered deck. A video plays on a big screen TV introducing the upcoming flight and explaining steps to take in an emergency. At home, crashing never crossed my mind. I never saw any problems with seaplanes on Fantasy Island or in James Bond movies. If something went wrong, I assumed a life jacket would protect me until the Coast Guard came to my rescue. The video made me think otherwise. While newlyweds, middle-aged couples, and seniors arrive and watch the video, I Google seaplane accidents. One study concludes that seaplanes crash more than land airplanes. No one on the airport crew mentions this detail. A tightness takes hold of my stomach. I keep reading. Speed isn't the problem. The common reasons for accidents frequently involve poor pilot judgment, flying too close to water and trees, failing to accurately weigh the plane's cargo, prioritizing performance over safety, and landing improperly. A report from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada suggests seaplane accidents result in more deaths compared to land airplanes. The difference stems from the fact that most seaplane accidents end in water, where over 50% of pilots and passengers drown. So much for a life jacket keeping me safe. A footnote provides some solace, explaining that many seaplane studies contain limited and outdated data that make their conclusions anecdotal rather than factual. I turn away from my phone to study the plane. Thank you for your attention.
Good evening. I'm Jessica Morgan, and I'll be reading an excerpt from my short story titled Genocidal Tendencies. The story is about a group of international doctors who were traveling through Rwanda in the middle of the genocide crisis in 1994, working with Doctors Without Borders. The morning they were captured was beautiful. Anise had woken up last, beaten to the teapot in the kitchenette of their small apartment by Halim and Madeira by at least a half an hour. She'd skipped breakfast, taking a granola bar in place of her usual eggs and toast, then packed up her day bag, equipment, and a box of small toys for the younger children before the three of them left for the church. The weather was cool as they drove, blades of banana trees directing the breeze over the market as it blew through the village. The sun had lifted into a cloudless sky over the forest, and the smell of sweet potatoes from breakfast lingered as people moved in and out of their homes. She and the others had arrived at the village 4 days earlier, carefully choosing Bisesero as their destination because of its distance from Kigali. She knew the Interahamwe were expanding their grasp, but the United Nations had already sent personnel to the region and was coordinating with allies to establish a peace deal. The villagers were well aware of the atrocities near Kigali, but no one trusted the news passed from town to town. They simply hoped they would not be pulled into the conflict so far out into the countryside. Anise had treated 7 patients and just greeted the 8th when screaming broke out past the gate. She jumped up to see what had happened and saw one of the militiamen attack an elderly man with a machete, then slit his wife's throat. Families waiting in line for vaccinations and exams scattered instantly, running to the trees and away from the square. The militiamen shot at the walls of the courtyard, killing several men, one of whom she just treated, and wounding 3 children. Anise, Salim, and Madeira took cover inside, helping a pregnant woman who'd been grazed by a bullet when the militiamen broke through the front door to the chapel. The men fanned out through the pews, blocking the windows and doors, trapping them all inside. Anise ducked down quickly, but the men spotted the 3 of them from behind the table near the altar and shouted for them to show themselves. Iriake, Iriake, he said. Halim stepped out first, hands high, Madeira after him. Anise stood up last, signaling to the pregnant woman behind the altar to stay quiet as she stepped into the aisle. One of the militiamen, the tallest one, walked up to Halim and asked who they were. Umuse Muzi, he answered, translator. And the women, Umuganga, doctors. They are with me. The one with the red hair, she is a doctor, the other a nurse. I translate for them. The militiaman paced in front of them, looking them over slowly, then stopped in front of Anise. She tried to avoid his gaze, but he wouldn't let her. He grabbed her by the throat and pulled her in close, forcing her to look into his eyes. Doctor, let us take a walk outside, he said. He let go of her neck and shoved her toward the door. Halim and Madeira followed. He directed them outside to the center of the courtyard. Another man, the shortest of the group, approached the tall man as he ordered them to their knees. The two of them exchanged word privately before the short man turned around and told Anise and the others to stand up and follow him to the back. They hesitated to move, cemented in place by their collective fear of being executed once they were out of sight of the other villagers. The tall man reached down and yanked Anise to her feet. "Now," he shouted. Madeira and Halim rose instantly and moved toward Anise, pulling her in close as they hurried to catch up to the short man. He walked them quickly around the side of the building, leading them past the priest's garden. As they shuffled by, they heard gunfire up from the church, followed by muffled screams that turned into silence. A few moments later, the short man stopped walking and spun around to face them. He gestured over his shoulder with his machete. "Here," he said. Here was a prison. On the edge of the village and built in what looked to be the 1950s, it stood out from the rest of the structures nearby with its high concrete walls, double-bar metal doors, and scarce windows. The short man led the three of them inside and separated them into individual cells. As he locked them in, the tall man came to Anisa's door and peered through the tiny window at her. He looked her over from top to bottom and grinned confidently as he turned to leave. "I will be back for you, doctor," he said. She hoped he wouldn't. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Hill Flores. I'm going to be reading from chapter 3 of my novel and stories called All the World's a Light. This chapter is called The Sleeping Porch. I'm starting in the middle. Papa was like a lot of men in these parts. Not good, not bad, just a man living in the place from where he was seated, like a radish or a turnip. You're born in a place, you grow up, your people have ways, and you follow them. You don't even think about it because you're trying to be something in the world, not even a big something. Just stay alive until you can have kids who will at least remember you were here once. You try to get along and make the best out of your lot. You fight with nature. Sometimes you win, but most of the time you lose. Crops, houses, parts of your body or mind. I came to live with Papa when I was a baby. He found me and Mommy on the side of the road where she was picking berries on our way to a new place. That's all I was ever told. But right now, I knew Papa wasn't trying to be ornery, asking if Miguel was a foreigner. Once in town, someone called my mother a gypsy and claimed she put a curse on the drunk man in the town square who always hit his wife right outside the church. The man went into a coma 2 weeks later and never woke up. "I can touch up the paint on your house, fences, and the barn," Miguel said. "Papa, he can paint the sleeping porch." The sky opened and heavy sheets of rain started moving toward the house. Despair flashed across Papa's face. "Papa built that porch on the side of the house when Mommy was sick." Miguel quickly turned toward the porch. "You don't need to know any of that, Mary," Papa said. One day, Mommy died on that sleeping porch. Valley fever, invisible fungus in the dust that killed a lot of people. Of course, we didn't know it back then. We thought it was typhus, so people had to quarantine. But when you don't know what's killing you, how can you fight it? She was tired and had a bloody cough that wouldn't stop. During the day, she'd be chilled to the bone, and at night, she would have terrible sweats. It was too much work to talk, with the coughing fits and shortness of breath, so she mainly stayed still and speechless aside from the violence in her body. She'd slip into deep states of quietness as she moved slowly back and forth in her favorite cane rocking chair, eyes closed. Sometimes she whispered the same thing over and over between coughing fits, something that sounded like home, but wasn't. Om. We found out that valley fever comes from tiny organisms floating around like an invisible army without anyone or anything to kill them. They flew, emerging from the soil that was abandoning all the farmers of the land. It was just flying away like it had every right to. The organisms are supposed to stay in the soil where they belong, where they could help things grow. Now the soil and those little devil angels were everywhere. Papa, thinking that typhus could heal better in the outdoors, put her on that porch with poison air flowing through it, and Mommy got worse and worse. At night, I'd sneak into the sleeping porch with a bandana wrapped around my face like a bandit. I'd tell stories back to her that she told me when I was young. If I got a detail wrong, she'd squeeze my hand as her way of telling me to try again, to remember, to get it right. In one story was a woman who knew how to cross the veil of life. When you say it like that, it seems like such a simple thing, like lifting a lace tablecloth from a slippery, smooth dining table. Lift and whoosh. In some ways, it is that easy, but not for most people. In the story, the lady could dance back and forth between life and death as easy as pie. I asked my mother why anyone would even want such a gift. What was the point of it? She'd say, the veil isn't a wall, something to be cut through or conquered. It was proof that we have many lives to live, that who we are has nothing to do with the meat on our bones or the thoughts in our heads. The world needs people to know this, who can travel back and forth, because those people become little lights in a world full of hate and dumb luck and superstitions that lead people astray. I didn't ever understand any of that being so young. Mommy, tell me if I get this part right. You don't have to say anything, just pucker your lips like you're going to kiss me. So in the story, the woman's daughter says, where should we bury you? And the mother says, under the live oak. And the daughter says, why there? And the mother says, there's a veil there. And the daughter says, a veil to wear. And the mother says, you'll see. Also, my body should do something good when it's gone. And the daughter says, you mean when you're gone? And the mother says, oh, I won't be gone. You'll come to visit me. And the daughter says, at the tree? And the mother says, no, be patient, you'll see. Wait for a miracle, but it won't be a miracle. It will be real, the most real thing. The wind will bring you. I would tell my mother the story, but she'd barely ever squeeze my hand to correct me anymore. It's a funny thing talking to your own mother about death when she's laid up so sick that she might be gone at any moment. But we always talked about death like it was the end of a chapter in a book. She wasn't afraid of it, and when I'd ask her why, she'd wink and say something like, you'll see.
Thank you all for sharing those incredible stories with us tonight. So thank you to all of our readers, and thank you to our audience for joining us this evening. Have a good evening.